Okay, then, so we're up to Daf Ayin Tes, and we'll begin momentarily. So the Gemara now on Daf Ayin Tes is going to analyze our Mishnah, because our Mishnah is very strange in that it has a Reish and a Seifa, and they both seem to be two sides of the same coin, and we should be able to derive one from the other. The principle is the same, identical in both the Reish and the Seifa. The Gemara is going to ask, Utzricha, why do we need both? And the basic principle is that if we don't know whether or not the father was Makabel Kiddushin before the Shliach that he had appointed, or on the contrary, the Shliach was first, so we don't know which Kiddushin is first, then she'll require a get from both the husband that was accepted for Kiddushin by the Shliach and the husband that was accepted for Kiddushin by the father himself. And they can make an agreement between the two of them, these two potential Balim or Suffolk Balim, and one will give a get and the other will marry. And the same thing applies in the Seif of our Mishnah in the case where she appointed a Shliach, and at the same time she went ahead and she was Makabel Kiddushin. Utzricha. Deyashmin and Gabi Dite. If we only had the Reisha, Dite means when the father sent a Shliach, we would say that the father is in effect being mevatel his shlichus. Why? Because he knows who is the best suited candidate to marry suitor for his daughter. And therefore, when the father, decides to go ahead and be Makabel Kiddushin, he's basically tacitly or implicitly making a statement of Bitla Shlichus. Aval Isisa. So that's called Mikshum Gavri Kimle B'Yuchsin. Yuchsin meaning, in a literal sense, who's kosher, and in a figurative sense, who's worthy of his daughter. Aval, in the case of the Sefer Isisa, Lo Kimla B'Yuchsin. She's not a Bekia in Yuchsin to identify which is the proper Miyuchas to marry her. And therefore, I might have thought Lo Nevi Kiddushin. She's not being Mavatal the Shlichus. And therefore, let's consider the possibility that the Shliach functioned as her Shliach. He was Makabel Kiddushin to a person who's a better suited candidate. He's more Miyuchas. And therefore, I need the Mishnah to tell me the second din that even if the Isha herself sent a Shliach, and then she herself received Kiddushin, then her Kiddushin is valid. And now we turn it the other way around. If the Mishnah had only told me the Seifa, in a case where she sent a Shliach, and then she was Makabel Kiddushin, Mishum de Isisa Daika u Mitzvah, we would have said the following, that in effect she wants to be Mavatal the Shliach. Why? Because she's going to be Medayik very, very carefully. Even though she's not a Bekia, she'll go through every piece of research without leaving a single leaf unturned to guarantee that she found the right man. And therefore, by going ahead and being Makabel Kiddushin, she has demonstrated that she doesn't want the Shliach. She wants to rely on her own Daiku Mitzvah. Aval Iu. But if it was a case where the father appointed a Shliach, Ema lo ichbasle, maybe we should say that the father doesn't care one way or the other. As far as he's concerned, let the Shliach choose a marriage partner that suits my daughter. Tzricha, and therefore we need both. Itmar. Now we're getting to the main sugya for today of machlokas between Rav and Shmuel. And this machlokas between Rav and Shmuel revolves around what's called a chazaka de meikara versus a chazaka. The Hashta will explain as we go along. Itmar. Kitcha avia baderech, her father found someone as he was on the road who would be an appropriate, in his opinion, choice for his daughter. And Kitcha atzma be'ir. But unbeknown to the father, the daughter herself, back in the city, was Makabel Kiddushin to a different person. Now, would we assume that the father had rishus over his daughter to be makabel kiddushin? Well, that depends. If she's a nara and kol shkena ketana, the answer is yes, she's b'rishus avir. But if she's a bogeres, she's 12 and a half, then she's already left the rishus of the father, and his kiddushin is void. Vaharehi bogeres. Now, this should be an open and shut case where the father's kiddushin is not valid. She's already bogeres. She can be makabel kiddushin on behalf of herself as bogeres, but the father is no longer in the picture. So why is there going to be a debate here between the person that her father was makabel kiddushin from and her? He, the father, is out of the picture. Rav Amar, you know what? Rav says we still have a suffix over here, because we don't know what was her status at the moment that she received Kiddushin. We know that today she's a bogeres. We're not sure if she was a bogeres at the time that the father was makabel Kiddushin. So Rav says, you know what? Her Kiddushin are valid, because let's look at her status today. Right now, she's a bogeres. And we apply the principle of chazaka d'meikara. Chazaka d'meikara means that we take the situation as it exists today, and we assume that that's what the situation and the status was yesterday. And therefore, harei hi bogeres lefanenu. Right now, she's a bogeres. And just like in the case of a mikveh, where we find out now that the mikveh doesn't have Arba'im son, if we assume that if a person jumped into this mikveh, he did not become tar, because harei chaser lefanecha, here too, harei bogeres lefanecha. And if right now, what we call the situation of hashta is such that the father is out of the ballpark, then we assume, taking the chazak and hashta lefanenu and going back a day, that at the time that he was makabel kiddushin, the father, he could not have had rishus over, she was a bogeres, and therefore she would only need a get, and we only recognize the marriage that she herself accepted kiddushin. And we're going to assume that when the father was makabel kiddushin, she was already a bogeres. Shmuel disagrees. We have to worry about the possibility that the Kiddushin Av is valid, meaning that when he was Makadisher, she was not a bogeres. Now she's a bogeres, but she wasn't then. In other words, we go back to the situation as it was from the day of her birth, which means that she was a katana, then she became a nara, and we assume that if we have a suffix on the Masechet Kiddushin of the father, we're going to assume that the Kiddushin was valid. That chazaka d'meikara tells me that the Kiddushin was on a nara, not on a bogeres. Again, Shmuel is not saying that one get will suffice. Certainly, Shmuel is operating with midinei sfeikus, and he would, without even a blink of an eye, he would certainly require a get from the suitor that she, the daughter herself, was makabel, because perhaps at that time she was a bogeres. But we also have to require, argue Shmuel, a second get from the Kiddushin Av. And that's based on the chazak and meikar. So whereas Rav puts all the emphasis on hashta, which is called lefanenu, and therefore since she's a bogeres, we assume she was a bogeres at the time that the father married her off, and therefore his Kiddushin is not valid. Shmuel says, no, we have to balance here between two chazakas. We have the chazaka of hashta, which tells me she's a bogeres, and the Kiddushin Av is invalid, but we also have a chazaka in meikara, and our original chazaka was that she was a nara, and therefore the Kiddushin of the father is valid. She needs two gittin. So the Gemara now asks the following question. Amos, when exactly did this Maisa occur? How old was she when her father was makabel Kiddushin and when she was makabel her own Kiddushin. If it's during the 6-month period between Naras and Bagras, a Naras at the age of 12 and a day, and a Bogeres 6 months down the line at the age of 12 and a half of a day, then Bahan name a Rav, then could it possibly be that Rav would say, Arei Bogeres lefanecha? What do you mean Bogeres lefanecha? At the time of the Kiddushin, she was not a Bogeres. And therefore, we have to assume Hashtahu de Bagra, but at the time of the Kiddushin, she wasn't a Bogeres. And therefore, there's a suffix here, and Rav would have to require 2 gittin. How could it be that Rav argues that she only needs a get from her own Kiddushin and not from the Kiddushin of the father, if we know that the Masechet Kiddushin took place during that 6-month period when she was a Nara? Hello, we have no choice. Liachar Shisha. The 6 months went by, she became a Bogeres, and then the father was Makabel Kiddushin. Why would that be a possible suffix for Shmuel, and Shmuel's going to require 2 gittin? But her name of Shmuel, could it possibly be that Shmuel says Chayshina leKiddushay Shneim? Ve'al Amar Shmuel ein beinaris lebagrus el shisha chadoshim milvad. After 6 months, past her 12th birthday, she becomes a Bogeres. And if the Kiddushin was given by the father, or received by the father, I should say, after 6 months, she's already Bogeres. Why would Shmuel require a get from the Kiddushay Av? And because of this bind that we're in between a rock and a hard place, it can't be a case of a Toch Shisha, it can't be a case of Liachar Shisha. The Gemara comes up with a very, very skinny kind of case. Skinny, I mean to say a very narrow petach. What's the case? Well, tzricha the Kaddish Ba'hu Yoma de Mashlim Shisha. On her half birthday, 6 months after her 12th birthday, that's when the Kiddushin came about. And now the question is, was she already Bogeres? For example, a Bogeres needs Simonim. When did these Simonim emerge? Before the Kiddushin, after the Kiddushin? The Kaddish Hahu Yoma de Mishlam Shisha Rav Amar Harehi Bogeres Lefanenu. Right now, she's a Bogeres. And we assume she's a Bogeres already in the morning of that 6-month time, and she had Shtei Saras. To me, the Hashta Bogeres, B'tzafra Nabi Bogeres. Now in the afternoon, on that day, I called it a half birthday, she became a Bogeres. We assume she became a Bogeres in the morning already. And that's the chazaka that a woman on the 6-month day will have and produce Simoni Kash, Gadus. So therefore, based on the chazaka, the hashta, Rav insists that the father's Kiddushin is out of the box, does not require a get. She only needs a get from the husband that she herself was Makabel Kiddushin for. Shmuel Omar. Shmuel says, wait a minute. You're looking at what she's like now? Chazaka the hashta? Maybe hashta who did I see Simona? Maybe now she had Simona, but maybe she didn't have Simona on the boker in the morning, and she was still a Nara, and her father could be Makabel Kiddushin. Shmuel says to Rav, how can you be so darn sure of yourself that she doesn't need a get from the father's Kiddushin? How do you know that she had Simoni Bagros in the morning? Because Harei Shalchol Lefanecha? Harei Lefanecha? Wait a minute. What about the Chazak of the Beikara? So Shmuel basically posits a head-on collision, I call it a tug-of-war, between the Chazak of the Beikara and the Chazak of the Hashta. This Mamela, we're in a suffix situation where we have to require 2 gittin. Rav, on the other hand, is oblivious to the Chazak of the Beikara, putting all the emphasis on the Chazak of the Hashta. Now she's a Bogeres. We assume in the morning she was already a Bogeres, and therefore the father's Kiddushin is invalid. Correct the Gemara, I don't understand Shmuel. What about the paradigmic case of a mikveh that had our Baim saw, we checked the mikveh today, and it only has 39 saw. And somehow, between those two time periods, we'll call it T1 and T2, right down the middle, a Tomei jumped into the mikveh. And the Mishnah tells me in the third parak, in the second parak of mikvahs, that in such a case, he remains Tomei. Maishna, mi mikvah. Tisnan, we learned in the Mishnah in mikvahs, mikvah shenimdad. V'nimtza chaser, all of a sudden, instead of our Baim saw, we put in the ruler, the measuring rod, and we find that it's got 39.9 saw. Is called Taro Shenasu al Gabav Lemafreya Bein Rishus HaYachid Bein Rishus HaRabim Tmeos. Which Chazaka reigns supreme? The Chazaka Dahashta. What does that sound like? Rav says she's a Bogeres now. Lefanecha, she was Bogeres in the morning, going back in time. And if we apply the principle of Rav, then we understand this Gemara perfectly, Mishnah and Mikvahs. Now the mikvah is chaser. We assume it was chaser when he went into the mikvah to be mitar himself. But according to Shmuel says that even though that now she's a Bogeres, but she had a chazok ne'meikara, here the chazok ne'meikara is such that the mikvah is male, not chaser but male. And you're going to go ahead and burn taros and assume that for sure she's the taros that were dunked into the mikveh are tmeos, and then you go burn it? And we're up to shiny hustle. At this point, the Gemara is going to say that the din of mikveh is different than the din of a father who's makabel Kiddushin for a daughter who might be a nara, might have been already a bogeres. Shiny Hassam. The case of mikvahs is fundamentally different. The ikal meimar hamed tame al cheskasa. You're not just dealing with the mikvah. The mikvah is not the only chazaka. Yeah, you're right. Shmuel puts all the emphasis on the chazaka dahashta. That's right. On the chazaka meikar. And therefore the mikvah should be deemed kosher. But what about the chazaka the tameh? Or the kalim that were put into this mikvah? There also there's a chazaka meikar. And there the chazaka meikar is tameh. So don't attack Shmuel from the Mishnah in Mikvahs, because the Mishnah Mikvahs is not just dealing with the chazaka of the mikvah, but also the chazaka of the other mekalim that jumped into the mikvah. Shani Hassam the ikal meimar hamei tomei al chezkaso the emor shelo tov al kidin. So Shmuel is perfectly justified here. Even if in the case of Bogeres, Shmuel is going to go back to the Chazak and Mikar that she was a Nara, and therefore require a get from the Kiddushin Av. And you want to now apply the same logic to a mikvah and say, let's go back to the Chazak and Mikar and we be Mitar the Tmei. We can't be Mitar the Tmei if they have Chazak of Tameh. You want to change the status quo and assume they became Tahar, you got to prove it. And until you prove it, with Hamed Adam al Chezkasa. Of course, against that, you have the Chazak and Hashta. So we pit one Chazak against the other, Chazak and Meikara, Chazak and Hashta, and it becomes a Suf. So basically, the Gemara at this point is holding the following, according to Shmuel. In the case of Kiddushin Av, we're going to have to require 2 Gittin because even though she's a Bogeres today, there's a possibility that she was a Nara this morning, which would validate the Kiddushin of the father, and therefore we require 2 Gittin. So it's Chazakari, the Meikara against Chazakari Hashta, and therefore we're in a suffix situation. However, in the case of a mikveh, it's radically different. Because we have a principle called Hamed Gavral Cheskase. And here the Cheskes Tamed. So now you're going to say there's a suffix? Yeah, but a suffix can't undo the Cheskes Tumah of the Gavra. Gemara rejects. Adarabba. Hamed is a mikvah Cheskase. V'emelo Chase. What's the chazak and meikar of the mikvah? You want to put all the emphasis on the chazak and meikar of the tameh, which is named the cheskes tumah. What about the chazak and meikar of the mikvah? And the Gemara assumes that the cheskas ha-mikvah will be misgaber, will trump the cheskas ha-gavra shetaval b'mikvah. Because the status of the gavra now depends upon whether the mikvah was molei or chassid. And if you have reason to believe that just like yesterday it was mole, so today too it's mole, since so be it. And the mele, the tameh is tar. So the Gemara is actually very satisfied with Shmuel. Why? In the case of mikvarei chasil lefanecha, and therefore, when we deal with the mikvah itself, we cannot establish the mikvah to be mullet. We see it's chasil, and we're going to say that we'll apply the chazaka to meikara. I'm sorry. We're going to apply the chazaka to hashta. Just like now we find it to be chassid. It was chassid in the morning at the time that the tummy jumped into the mikveh. So basically, now it comes out that you have 2 chazakas working together in a unity cabinet. You have both the chazaka of hashta in the mikveh, chasil lefanecha, and you have the cheskas tuma of the gavra who went into the mikveh. Is memela kol tarash and asal gam and kulam tmeis. So why didn't Shmuel apply the logic of chazaka to hashta and therefore require a get? Sorry. Everything works out perfectly. We have no questions. Because if we apply the chazaka to hashta, then we have to validate the kiddushin of the father. Hence, Shmuel requires a get from that person who is Mekodesh Alidei Liyah. So, Hachinami Harei Bogeres Lefanecha. No, I'm sorry. Hachinami means let's be consistent. The Gemara is asking a question. Well, if Shmuel, when he deals with the mikvah, operates with chazak and a hashta, now the mikvah lefanecha is chaser, and therefore kol tama is tame, then why not say that just like today she's a bogeres, she was bogeres yesterday or this morning when her father was makabel Kiddushin? And why does Shmuel require a get from the suitor of the father? And the Gemara answers, Hashta hu de bagra. Right, we're looking at this Masechet Kiddushin, including the Masechet Kiddushin of the father. So if Shmuel is putting the emphasis on hashta, like in the case of mikvah where he says the tame because now it's chaser, then why does she need to get from the Kiddushin? Hasam nami hashta hu de chaser. So the Gemara answers, Hasam tarti l'reis. It's not so that Shmuel would pinpoint and limit the chazaka to the chazaka in the mikvah of hashta. He's got to also consider the chazaka on the other v'kelim that went into the mikvah, and that's a chazaka meikara. So in other words, the Gemara is saying that if Shmuel is willing to say hashta hu de bagra, I'm sorry, if Shmuel is willing to say that, just one second, I'm trying to get the Gemara's kasha. If Shmuel is willing to say that what? That the Kiddushin Av is valid, so obviously he's going back to the Chazaka de Meikara, that she was a Nara. Why doesn't he apply the Chazaka de Meikara in the case of the mikvah? And the mikvah was Moleh. And then we should say that the Kol Taras Shenasugem Kulub Tahoros. Hasam Tarti L'Reisa V'Hacha Chad Reisa. So I think what the Gemara means by Chad Reisa is that now we have a head-on collision between the Chazaka de Meikara, which is Nara, and the Chazaka de Hashta, which is Bogeres, and therefore she needs to give, according to Shmuel. So what does Gemara mean when it says Hasam Tarti L'Reisa? And I think what the Gemara is saying is that there's a head-on collision between Chazaka de Meikara and Chazaka de Hashta. The mikveh was Mole, and we assume it remains Mole. The mikveh is now Chaser, we assume it always was Chaser. So we're in a teku, a stalemate. So now we're going to introduce another Chazaka, and that is the Chazaka of the Kalim or the Adam that went into the mikveh that have Cheskas Tumah. Frek the Gemara l'Shmuel Maishna mi Chavis. Okay, now we're going to get into a brisa that deals with chometz as far as truma is concerned. So a man designates a chavis, and in that chavis, he places yayin. What is he going to do with the yayin in that chavis? Now he has to worry about his yayin that it might become chometz. Yayin, with the passage of time, becomes like vinegar, so to speak. Becomes impossible to drink. Now, chometz has a certain market value and a certain purpose. If you ordered yayin and I delivered chometz, you want a rebate. You want money back. Yayin is worth a lot more than chometz. So this person consistently designates a chavis, special chavis, that's earmarked for being mafresh truma onto other chavis. But he wears, so he says, Kevan shechosha shayayin yafach lechometz lo yuchal hafresh truma michavis zu shehi chometz al chavio shel yayin. So the premise here of this brisa is that yayin and chometz are two separate entities. And if you're afraid that the yayin is going to sour and turn into chometz, into vinegar, you won't be able to be mafresh truma from this chavis onto another chavis shel yayin, because now it becomes chometz, and you can't be mafresh chometz for yayin. Two different minim. So hayabodek es chavis. Lahafresh aleh truma. Veholech the achakach nimtzeis chometz. So he's checking out this chavis that he designated earmarked for Afrash's truma, and he wants to figure out if it became chometz or not. V'achakach. What's v'achakach? He says here, v'achakach means achar shetoram. Achar shetoram. And just 1 second, Rabbi. Charlie, can I call you back in a few minutes? Yep. Okay. Yeah, because this is not usually the hour that we learn. So what happens? He checks out the chavis because he wants to be somech on the fact that it's still yayin and it hasn't become chometz, so he can be mafresh truma from this chavis. V'nimtzeis chometz. And he did the bedika after he was mafresh. So the question is, what was the status of the yayin in the chavis at the time that he was mafresh? We don't know. Was it already chometz, like it is now? Or do we say no, that it became chometz after the afrasha? So the Brisa establishes the following rule. Kol shloshes yomim vada. Mikan v'yelet safek. So the word vada here means vada yayin, which would be a good thing for the Jews. It validates his hafrasha. And that's going to be for Shloshi Yomim. But after the Shloshi Yomim, then we have a suffix situation. Because it may have become chometz. Now, the Gemara is not ready to ask a kasha on Shmuel. First, the Gemara has to ask a kasha from one brisa onto the other. Uraminon, chavis ha-mikvah. Let's go back to the discussion about mikvah and compare it to the discussion about chavis. And we have a discrepancy. Maishna dahacha vadai. In the case of the mikvah, we said that if we find it today to be chaser, then everything's tameh. So again, if we go back to the bedika, we would have found that the mikvah was mullet. But now we're going to assume, since we found it chaser, that immediately after the bedika it became chaser. Umayshna hacha. But here in the case of chavis, even after the 3 days subsequent to the bedika, it's a suffix. We're not going to say it vadai, it became chometz immediately after the bedika. We're going to have to wait 3 days. So to reconcile this, Amar Rab Chanina Misuria, Man Tana Chavis. Who's the author of Chavis? Rabbi Shimoni. And Rabbi Shimon's unique shita in Chavis is that after 3 days there's a suffix. Tigabi mikveh nami sfeika mashve. And Rabbi Shimon, even in the case of mikveh, is going to call it a suffix, just like he does in the case of chavis. So now we're going to make a distinction between Rosh Hashanah and Rosh Hashanah, because we have a principle in suffix that if it's in Rosh Hashanah, no matter how many sfeikas you have, it's tameh. If it's Rosh Hashanah, even one suffix is tar. Desanya, as we learned in the price with regard to mikvah, kol tara shenaso agabav lemafreya bein b'shusayach bein b'shusarabim tmeos. This we saw, and Rabbi Shimon disagrees. Omer, it all depends where this happened. If the mikvah is a private mikvah, that's called b'shusayachid. Or no. Maybe it's in Rosh Hashanah. It's a public mikveh. So he says, before Reb Shimon, that ben Rosh Hashanah, ben Rosh Hashanah, tmeos. So there's no suffix here. And therefore, even in Rishus HaRabim, we're going to say Tomim. Reb Shimon Omer, he disagrees. And Rishus HaRabim, Taharos, he sees it as a suffix, not as a Vadai Tumah. But Rishus HaYachid told it. Tolin means it's a suffix, it remains a suffix. So let's calculate. According to Reb Shimon, there's no difference between chavis and mikvah. In both cases, you have a suffix. So far, we have no cash on Shmuel. But the Gemara continues. And now we're really ready, almost ready for the cash on Shmuel. Aval Rabbanon, right? Everything we said is according to Reb Shimon, but the Rabbanon held that the mikveh, even in Rishus Harabim, is tameh, meaning kol ataros atmeim. Let's apply that logic to chavis. Is tevel mafreya? In other words, we're going to say now it's chometz, and we're going to say it was already chometz at the time of the afrasha, and therefore the afrasha is not chal. So now we're back to the stira in Shmuel. On the one hand, with regard to a narish bagra, Shmuel's of the opinion that we have to be very careful about the Kiddushin Ha'av. On the other hand, Shmuel's going to require a get also because of Kiddushin Ha'bas. So that means he's got to suffer. Now, according to the Rabbanon, we have to evaluate, just like now she's a Bogeres, she was Bogeres at the time of the Kiddushin Ha'av, and therefore his Kiddushin is not valid. So how do we reconcile Shmuel with the Rabbanon of Tevel Mafreya? So again, the logic that underlies the Rabbanon that everything is tameh is the fact that now we see that the mikveh is chassid. So how could Shmuel say that in the case of yayin and chometz it's a suffix? He writes here, it's a suffix. We don't know if to validate the Kiddushin Ha'av or to validate the Kiddushin Ha'bas. And l'Rabbanan, we're going to say that just like now the mikveh is chassid, therefore there's no suffix. And this mikveh does not have the possibility to be mitayr. Is so too in the case of a bas bogeres. And therefore, if she's a bogeres now, then we assume she's a bogeres at the time of the Kiddushin Aviyah. Just like in the case of Yayin in the Chavis, we said it's Tevel and Mafreya. The Gemara answers no. Shani Hasam. That din in the case of Chavis is different. Why? The Ikal and Meimar Hame Tevel al Chezkaso. In other words, it's not enough just to look at the chavis and say, well, the chavis had yayin. Now we find it's got chometz, and then determine based on chazakas what's the status of the chavis. No. You have to determine the status of the grapes from which you made wine, and those grapes became tevel. And you have to determine whether or not there was a valid afrashas truma to remove these tevel. So when you're dealing with the question of the chavis of whether or not it's got yayin and or chometz at the time of the afrasha, you have to worry about the cheskas tevel of the peiros. More rejects it. Adarab. In the case of chometz, hamid yayin al cheskaso. What was the original physical status of the yayin? It wasn't chometz; it was yayin. The aimer lo hichmitz, and then I delay the process of chimutz as late as I can, which would mean that the afrasha should be chal, the afrasha truma should be chal, kidasu kidin, even though today it's chometz, because we go back to the chazak beikara, and that was yayin. The aimer lo hichmitz. So why are we establishing tevel here? According to the Rabbanan, tevel mafreya he calls it. What about the chazaka of the yayin itself? The yayin has a cheskas yayin, and the Gemara says harei shehichmitz lefanecha. Okay, hichmitz lefanecha means right now it's chametz. So you want to apply the chazaka on this chavis of chometz. It's now chometz. It was chometz time of afrasha, and therefore the Rabbanan insist that it's tevel mafreya. Is hochenami harei he bogeres lefanecha. So why is Shmuel concerned about Kiddushin Av? Now she's a bogeres. She was a bogeres at the time of the Kiddushin Av, and it's invalid. And the Gemara says, "Hashtahu de bogra." Right, we have a chazak and meikara that tells me that she was a nara, and we're going to delay the process of change from nara, transformation from nara to bogeres, and make it the latest as possible. And therefore, when the father was makabel Kiddushin, she was in fact a nara. So the Gemara asks, Hasam Nami, again in the case of Chavis, Hashtu the Achmitz. Why don't we say that right now the Yayin became a Chometz? The Gemara answers, as we've seen in the past, Hasam Tati L'Reisa, Hacha Chada L'Reisa. Then in the case of the Masechet, we have two negatives that join forces. Number one, it's a chazaka. And the chazaka hashta is that it's yayin. That the yayin in the chavis was already chometz. But against that, we have what? We have the chazaka mikar that it was yayin, and we have the tevel. I'm saying you have the chazaka hashta that it's chometz, and you have the cheskes tevel. That's tati l'reisa. But hacha, I'll call you right back. But hacha chadal reisahu is only one reisa to ika. Right? What's the reisa against the Kiddushin Av? Because now she's a bogeres. So when we're dealing with the Maisa Kiddushin of the father, we only have one reisa. And therefore we have to be choshesh to the Kiddushin Av because of the chazak beikara. But in the case of the chavis, we have a double reisa. Number one, we find it now to be chometz, and number two, you had tevel. And now you want to say that there was hafrasha to remove the status of tevel, and we're going to apply the chazak. And at the end of this whole business, the Gemara says, Neima kitanoi, that maybe the machlokas between Rav and Shmuel is really in effect a machlokas tanoim, which the Gemara is going to analyze now based on a brisa, which is brought down here on Daf Ayin Tes Amid Beis that has to do with a person who writes his possessions when he's a Shchib Meirah to give it away.